The scorching sun beat down mercilessly as Abigail Wright's trembling fingers tore at the hard earth. Her cotton dress soaked with sweat and caked with dust from the vast cotton fields of Thornwood, Texas. It was the summer of 1876, and for the past 3 years, she had known nothing but the brutal reality of indentured servitude on the Marshall plantation. "Faster, girl!" Hiram Marshall bellowed, his riding crop slapping against his leather boot as he surveyed his workers from atop his chestnut stallion. "Those quotas ain't gonna meet themselves." Abigail's throat burned with thirst, her lips cracked and bleeding. 22 years old, and already her body felt twice that age. The other workers, mostly freed slaves and desperate immigrants, kept their heads down, knowing better than to show sympathy. Friendship was a luxury none could afford under Marshall's watchful eye. "I'm trying, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The cotton pricked her fingers, leaving tiny spots of blood on the white balls she collected. 3 more rows before sundown seemed impossible. Her story was painfully common in post-war Texas. After her parents died of fever, leaving behind nothing but debts, the local magistrate had generously offered her as payment to Marshall. The contract was for 5 years of labor to settle her father's outstanding loans. She'd been 19 then, naive enough to believe she'd be treated with some small measure of dignity. That illusion had shattered within her first week. As the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, Abigail's vision began to blur. Her basket was only half full, and Marshall had promised a lashing for anyone who failed to meet their quota. She forced herself forward, one painful step after another, ignoring the way her lungs seemed to seize with each breath. "Water!" she gasped, but no one was listening. The overseer had moved to the far end of the field, berating an elderly man whose pace had slowed. Abigail never felt the impact when she hit the ground. One moment she was reaching for another cotton ball, and the next, darkness clouded her vision as her legs simply gave way beneath her. The last thing she heard was the angry shout of Marshall calling her worthless. "Get up, Wright, get up, or there'll be hell to pay." But Abigail couldn't move. Her body had finally surrendered to weeks of 18-hour days, insufficient food, and the merciless Texas heat. As consciousness slipped away, she thought she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. New horses, unfamiliar voices, but it couldn't matter now. Nothing could. Preston Xavier had not intended to stop at the Marshall plantation. His destination was farther west, the silver boom towns of Idaho, where a man could remake himself. After 5 years of drifting since the war ended, the former cavalry scout was ready to settle somewhere far from Texas, and its blood-soaked memories. But his horse needed rest, and the Marshall property was the first sign of civilization he'd seen in 2 days of hard riding. As he approached the main house, the sight of the cotton fields gave him pause. Even from a distance, he could see the workers stooped under the afternoon sun, moving with the desperate lethargy of the overworked and underfed. "State your business," called a man at the gate, rifle balanced casually against his shoulder. "Looking for water for my horse and perhaps a meal for myself," Preston replied, his hand resting casually near his holster. "Willing to pay fair." The guard nodded toward the main house. "Boss is out in the fields. You can wait on the porch if you want." Preston tipped his hat and guided his dun mare toward the imposing white house. As he passed the edge of the cotton field, the commotion caught his attention, a cluster of workers surrounding something, or someone, on the ground. Useless piece of trash. A man in a white suit was shouting, pushing through the gathered workers. "Get her up and working, or you'll all share her punishment." Preston slowed his horse. The figure on the ground was a woman, young, from what he could see her dress stained with sweat and dirt. Even from this distance, he could tell she wasn't moving. Something cold settled in his stomach. He'd seen similar scenes during the war, when Confederate prison camps had been liberated people worked until their bodies simply gave out. "Excuse me," he called, steering his horse toward the commotion. "Seems like you've got a situation there." The man in the white suit, Marshal, Preston presumed, turned with irritation. "Just a lazy worker, nothing that concerns travelers." Preston dismounted, his boots landing with a soft thud on the hard, packed earth. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of hard living, with eyes that had seen too much killing to be intimidated by plantation owners. "She needs water and shade," he said, kneeling beside the fallen woman. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath his fingers as he touched her wrist. "She's got heat stroke. What she needs is to fulfill her contract," Marshall snapped. "3 more years of service she owes me, and by God, I'll get every day's worth." Preston looked up at the plantation owner, taking in the cruel set of his mouth, the riding crop clutched in his manicured hand. "How much?" "How much what?" Marshall asked, taken aback. "How much to buy out her contract?" Preston wasn't sure what had prompted the question. He had barely $300 to his name, money meant to start his new life in Idaho. Marshall laughed. "She's not for sale. Good workers are hard to come by, even the occasionally disobedient ones." $300, Preston said, standing to his full height. "Cash right now for her papers and freedom." A murmur went through the gathered workers. Marshall's eyes narrowed, calculating. "You some kind of abolitionist. War's been over for years, son." "Just a man making a business offer," Preston replied evenly. $300 for a worker who, at the moment, isn't working at all. Seems like a fair deal to me." Marshall studied him for a long moment, then smiled thinly. $500. $350 is all I can do," Preston countered, knowing he was bargaining away his future for a stranger. $400 and you take her right now, no coming back to make trouble." Marshall extended his hand. "Papers will be ready in an hour." Preston nodded once sharply and shook the man's hand. "I'll need a wagon to transport her to town, for medical attention." $30 extra for the use of a wagon for the day," Marshall said without missing a beat. "Return it to the livery in town by tomorrow noon." As Marshall strode away to prepare the paperwork, Preston knelt again beside the unconscious woman. One of the other workers had brought a dipper of water, and Preston gently lifted her head, letting a few drops pass her cracked lips. "Miss, can you hear me?" Abigail's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Her breathing was shallow, her skin hot to the touch. "What's her name?" he asked the woman who'd brought the water. "Abigail Wright," the older woman whispered. "She's been here 3 years. Parents died, left debts. Marshall bought her papers from the court." Preston nodded grimly. It was a familiar story. The war had left many destitute, and the unscrupulous were quick to exploit desperation. "Abigail," he said quietly, "I'm getting you out of here. Just hold on a little longer." An hour later, Preston guided the borrowed wagon away from the Marshall plantation, his mare tied to the back. In the wagon bed, Abigail lay on a thin pallet, her face partially shaded by a piece of canvas Preston had rigged up. Her indenture papers were tucked securely in his saddlebag, along with a receipt for $430, nearly everything he had. The nearest town with a doctor was 15 miles away. As the wagon bumped along the rutted road, Preston wondered what madness had possessed him to spend his future on rescuing a stranger. Maybe it was the memory of his younger sister, Sarah, who hadn't survived the war. Maybe it was simply that he'd seen too many people treated like property not to act when he had the chance. Whatever the reason, he was now responsible for Abigail Wright, a woman he'd never spoken to, bound for a future he could no longer afford. The town of Clearwater came into view as the sun was setting. Its single street was lined with the usual establishments: saloon, general store, livery, and a small building with a weathered sign identifying it as Dr. Thompson's medical office. Preston brought the wagon to a stop outside the doctor's door and jumped down from the seat. The door opened before he could knock. "Another sunstroke case?" asked the gray-haired man who appeared, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Yes, sir. Been working in the fields all day from what I gather. Collapsed a few hours ago." Dr. Thompson nodded and called back into the building. "Martha, prepare the back room. We've got another field worker." Together, they carefully lifted Abigail from the wagon and carried her into the cool interior of the doctor's office. A stern-faced woman directed them to a small room with a narrow bed where they gently laid Abigail down. "Your wife?" Dr. Thompson asked as he began examining Abigail. "No," Preston answered. "I just happened to be passing by when she collapsed." The doctor gave him a sharp look but didn't press further. "She's suffering from heat exhaustion and dehydration, possibly malnourished as well by the look of her. We'll get some fluids in her, cool her down. She should recover with rest." "How long?" "A few days before she should travel." "Are you planning to stay in town that long?" Preston nodded. "I'll find a room at the boarding house." Dr. Thompson named his fee $5 for the initial treatment, another $10 for the stay and continued care. Preston handed over the money, aware that his funds were dwindling rapidly. "I'll come back tomorrow morning," he said, looking down at Abigail's pale face. In the lamplight, he could see that, despite her condition, she was a striking woman: honey-blonde hair, high cheekbones, and a determined set to her jaw even in unconsciousness. "She'll be well looked after, Doctor," Thompson assured him. "Martha is an excellent nurse." As Preston turned to leave, the doctor added, "It was a good thing you did bringing her in. Marshall works his people too hard. We see at least one case like this every summer." "Why doesn't someone stop him?" the doctor sighed. "In these parts, a man can do as he pleases on his own land. The war changed some things, but not everything." Preston found a room at the town's small boarding house, paid for 2 nights, and then sought out the bathhouse. After washing away the dust of travel, he sat on the edge of his rented bed, counting his remaining money. $43 and some change, not nearly enough to start a new life in the Silver Country, but perhaps enough to get them both to Wallace, Idaho, if they traveled cheaply. Them both. The thought surprised him. He had no obligation to this woman beyond seeing her safely recovered. Yet somehow, in the span of a few hours, her fate had become entwined with his. "You're a damn fool, Xavier," he muttered to himself, but there was no heat in the words. The next morning, Preston returned to the doctor's office to find Abigail awake, though still weak. She was sitting up in bed, a cup of broth clutched in trembling hands, her eyes wary as he entered the room. "Good morning, Miss Wright," he said, removing his hat. "I'm Preston Xavier. I brought you to town yesterday after you collapsed." "Dr. Thompson explained," she said, her voice hoarse. "He said you paid Marshall for my contract." Preston nodded. "I did." "Why?" The question was direct, her blue eyes sharp with suspicion despite her weakened state. It was a fair question, one Preston had asked himself repeatedly through a sleepless night. "Because no one deserves to be worked to death in those fields," he finally answered. "I had the means to help, so I did." Abigail studied him for a long moment. "And what do you expect in return, Mr. Xavier?" The implication was clear, and Preston felt a flash of anger, not at her, but at the world that had taught her such wariness was necessary. "Nothing," he said firmly. "Your contract is fulfilled. The papers are yours once you're well enough to travel. You're a free woman, Miss Wright." Disbelief crossed her features. "Just like that, just like that." Abigail's hands tightened around her cup. "I have nowhere to go, no money, no family." Preston hesitated, then said, "I'm headed to Wallace, Idaho territory. There's work there in the silver mines, or so I've heard. I can offer you safe passage that far if you wish. After that, you'd be on your own." "Why would you do that?" she asked, the suspicion not entirely gone from her voice. "Because I'm headed there anyway," he said, which wasn't exactly a lie. He had been headed west, if not specifically to Wallace, before yesterday. "And because traveling alone isn't safe for a woman." Abigail looked down at her broth. "I have no better options," she admitted after a moment. "If you're sure it's no trouble." "No trouble," Preston assured her, though they both knew it wasn't that simple. "Rest now. Dr. Thompson says you'll need a few days before you're strong enough to travel." As he turned to leave, Abigail called after him. "Mr. Xavier." He paused at the door. "Thank you," she said simply. "I didn't think I'd ever leave that place alive." Preston nodded once and stepped out, closing the door gently behind him. In the front room, Dr. Thompson was organizing his medical supplies. "She's agreed to travel with me to Idaho," Preston told him. "Once she's well enough." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "Idaho's a long way from Texas, Mr. Xavier. You sure you know what you're doing?" Preston gave a wry smile. "Not in the slightest, but it seems like the right thing to do." "Well, Dr. Thompson said, she'll need at least 3 more days of rest before she should attempt any travel. And even then, you'll need to take it slow at first." Preston nodded. "I've got a wagon to return today, but I'll see about purchasing another, something more suitable for a long journey." Over the next few days, Preston made preparations for the journey north. He sold his mare, a decision that pained him, and purchased a sturdy wagon and a team of oxen instead. The animals were slower than horses but could better handle the long journey ahead and required less care. He stocked up on supplies: flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, and other essentials, spending nearly every dollar he had left. Each day, he visited Abigail, sitting by her bedside for an hour or so, talking about the route ahead and the opportunities that might await in Wallace. At first, their conversations were stilted, both of them uncertain of this strange arrangement, but gradually they began to share more of themselves. Abigail told him of her childhood in eastern Texas, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had once been the belle of their small town. How the war had changed everything, leaving her father broken in spirit and the family deep in debt. How after her parents succumbed to fever, Marshall had appeared with her father's promissory notes, claiming rights to her labor as payment. In turn, Preston spoke of his time as a cavalry scout, skimming over the worst horrors of the war. He told her of his family's small farm in Missouri, now run by his older brother, and his decision to head west after years of drifting through Texas and Louisiana. "Why Wallace?" she asked on the third day as she sat in a chair by the window, color finally returning to her cheeks. "Heard there's silver there. Enough that a man can make a decent living without selling his soul," Preston replied. "And it's far enough from the war that maybe people don't carry its ghost so heavily." Abigail nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Do you think there might be work for someone like me? I can read and write. My father made sure of that. I could teach, perhaps, or keep books." "A boomtown always needs educated people," Preston assured her. "And if teaching doesn't pan out, there's always cooking or laundering for the miners. Hard work, but honest, and you'd be paid fair." On the fourth day, Dr. Thompson declared Abigail fit enough to begin traveling, though he cautioned against pushing too hard at first. "Take it easy the first week," he advised as Preston settled the final bill. "No more than 10 miles a day until she's regained her strength." "We're in no hurry," Preston agreed, though in truth, their funds were limited. He'd managed to sell some items, he'd been carrying a good knife. His father's pocket watch to add a few dollars to their traveling money, but it would still be a lean journey. Abigail emerged from her room wearing a simple blue dress that Martha had helped her alter from donated clothing. Her hair was neatly braided, and though she was still thin, her eyes were clear and determined. "Ready?" Preston asked, offering his arm. She nodded, taking his arm with only the slightest hesitation. "As I'll ever be." The wagon was loaded with their meager possessions, and the supplies Preston had purchased. A canvas cover provided shade and would offer some protection from rain. It wasn't luxurious, but it was sturdy and practical, as Preston helped Abigail onto the wagon seat. "Doctor." Thompson pressed a small package into his hands. "Medicine," the doctor explained. "Tonic for strength, willow bark for pain, and a salve for sunburn. No charge," he added when Preston reached for his money. "Consider it my contribution to your fresh start." With grateful thanks and a promise to send word once they reached Wallace, Preston climbed up beside Abigail and took the reins. The oxen moved forward with a gentle lurch, and they were on their way. The first day, they traveled only 8 miles before making camp near a small creek. Preston helped Abigail down from the wagon and insisted she rest while he set up their camp, a small fire, a pot of beans set to cook, and bedrolls laid out on opposite sides of the fire. "I can help," Abigail protested as she watched him work. "I'm not an invalid." "You were 3 days ago," Preston reminded her. "Dr. Thompson said to take it easy." She sighed but settled on a blanket near the fire. "I'm not used to idleness. 3 years at Marshall's, there was never a moment to rest." "Well, consider this making up for lost time," Preston said, stirring the beans. "Besides, there'll be plenty of work ahead. We've got nearly 2,000 miles to cover." As the sun set, they ate their simple meal in companionable silence. The night was warm, stars emerging in a clear sky above them. "Do you have family in Wallace?" Abigail asked as Preston banked the fire for the night. He shook his head. "Don't know a soul there." "You?" "No," she said softly. "I don't have anyone anywhere anymore." Preston looked at her across the glowing embers. "You're not alone now," he said, the words coming unbidden. "We'll figure things out together when we get there." A small smile curved Abigail's lips. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier." "Preston," he corrected. "If we're going to be traveling together for months, I think we can use first names." "Preston," she repeated. "And I'm Abigail, though my friends, when I had them, called me Abby." "Abby," he said, testing the name. It suited her somehow, softer than the more formal Abigail, yet still strong. "Get some rest, Abby. Tomorrow's another day on the trail." As promised, they took the journey slowly at first, covering only 10 to 12 miles each day. They followed the main roads where possible, occasionally joining other travelers for safety, though Preston was careful to keep a certain distance. 2 people traveling alone, a man and a woman, not apparently married, invited questions, and sometimes judgment. When asked, Preston introduced Abigail as his sister, a fiction she accepted with a nod and a practiced smile. It was simpler than explaining the truth. As days turned into weeks, Abigail's strength returned. The harsh Texas sun had bronzed her skin, but proper food and rest had brought a healthy flush to her cheeks. She insisted on taking on more camp duties, cooking their meals and mending their clothes in the evenings. Their route took them northwest through Indian Territory, a journey fraught with potential dangers. They traveled with greater caution here, sometimes joining larger wagon trains for safety, other times making cold camps without fires to avoid drawing attention. It was during one such night, camped in a small grove of trees with only the stars for light, that Abigail first spoke of her fears. "What if Wallace isn't what we hope?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if there's no place for us there? Preston, who had been checking the oxen's harnesses by touch, paused. Then we move on. The West is full of new towns springing up. We'll find somewhere. Abigail asked. You still plan to stay with me after we arrive? Preston hadn't actually thought that far ahead, but he found himself nodding. If that's what you want, we make a good team, don't we? In the dim starlight, he couldn't see her expression clearly, but her voice was warm when she replied, Yes, we do. As they crossed into Colorado territory, the landscape changed dramatically. The flat plains gave way to rolling foothills, and in the distance, the majestic peaks of the Rocky Mountains rose against the sky. The air grew cooler, the nights sometimes requiring an extra blanket. They passed through small settlements and trading posts, occasionally stopping to replenish supplies or to let the oxen rest for a day or two. In these places, Abigail would sometimes find work washing clothes or cooking for a local establishment, earning a few precious dollars to extend their dwindling funds. Preston, too, would take odd jobs when available, chopping wood, repairing buildings, or helping local lawmen deal with troublemakers. His skills as a former scout were valued, especially his marksmanship and tracking abilities. It was in a small Colorado settlement called Elk Creek that their relationship began to shift. They had stopped for 3 days to rest the oxen and earn some money. Abigail had found work at the local boarding house, while Preston had been hired to help the sheriff track down a man who had stolen several horses from local ranchers. When Preston returned on the second day, the thief apprehended and the horses recovered, he found Abigail waiting anxiously at their wagon. I was worried, she admitted, her hand touching his arm lightly, when you didn't come back last night. Got caught in a thunderstorm, he explained. Had to wait it out in an old mining shack. I'm sorry I couldn't send word. She nodded, relief evident in her face. I'm just glad you're safe. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to you. The vulnerability in her voice made something twist in Preston's chest. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. I'll always come back, Abby, he said softly. That's a promise. For a long moment they stood there, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then, slowly, deliberately, Abigail raised herself on tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. See that you do, she whispered, then turned and walked back to the boarding house, leaving Preston standing by the wagon, his hand raised to the spot her lips had touched. That night, he lay awake in his bedroll beneath the wagon, replaying the moment in his mind. He had not allowed himself to think of Abigail as anything more than a traveling companion, a person in need whom he had helped. But somewhere along the miles of dusty roads and shared campfires, she had become more. The realization should have unsettled him. Preston had avoided entanglements since the war, preferring the simplicity of a drifter's life. Yet the thought of Abigail as more than a friend felt right somehow, as if the puzzle pieces of his fractured life were finally finding their proper places. The next day, as they prepared to continue their journey, there was a new awareness between them. Their hands would brush as they loaded supplies into the wagon, and each time they would share a small smile, an acknowledgement of this uncharted territory they were entering together. As they left Elk Creek behind, Abigail sat closer to him on the wagon seat than she had before. When Preston cautiously put his arm around her shoulders as they navigated a particularly rough stretch of road, she leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "Is this all right?" he asked quietly. "More than all right," she replied, her voice steady despite the blush coloring her cheeks. The journey continued northward, through the mountains of Colorado and into the high plains of Wyoming territory. The landscape grew wilder, settlements fewer and farther between. But with each passing day, Preston and Abigail grew closer. In the evenings, after they made camp, they would sit side by side, sometimes talking late into the night, other times simply enjoying the comfortable silence between them. Occasionally, Preston would take out the battered harmonica he carried and play simple tunes, and sometimes Abigail would sing along in a clear, sweet voice that made his heart ache with its beauty. It was on a crisp autumn evening in the foothills of the Tetons that Preston finally found the courage to kiss her. They had made camp near a small lake, the water reflecting the sunset's golden light. Abigail had waded ankle-deep into the shallows, her skirts hitched up, laughing at the cold water against her skin. "Come in," she called to him. "It's wonderful." Preston had removed his boots and joined her, the cold water shocking against his feet. Abigail's laughter was infectious, and soon they were splashing each other like children, their worries temporarily forgotten. When they finally returned to shore, breathless and dripping, Abigail's hair had come loose from its braid, falling in damp waves around her shoulders. The setting sun caught the gold in her hair, creating a halo effect that made Preston's breath catch. "You're beautiful," he said simply, the words escaping before he could consider them. Abigail's laughter faded, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. "No one's called me that in a very long time." "Then they weren't looking properly," Preston said, stepping closer to her. "Because you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Her eyes searched his face, perhaps looking for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, she reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Preston," she whispered, and his name on her lips was an invitation he could no longer resist. He leaned down, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Abigail rose to meet him, their lips connecting in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepening as her arms wound around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Abigail's eyes were wide, her lips curved in a wondering smile. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," Preston admitted, his arms still around her waist. "What took you so long?" she asked, a teasing light in her eyes that he'd never seen before. "Wasn't sure you'd welcome it," he said honestly. "Wasn't sure I had the right." Abigail's expression softened. "You've never treated me like property, Preston. Not once since you bought my contract. That right there gave you every right to court me properly, if that's what you're asking. Is it proper courting if we're already traveling together, sleeping under the same stars every night?" He asked, only half joking. She laughed. "I don't think anything about our situation is proper by society's standards, but it feels right to me. Does it to you?" In answer, Preston kissed her again, pouring into it all the feelings that had been building over their months of travel, the admiration for her strength, the joy in her laughter, the deep, abiding care that had grown with each passing day. That night, they laid their bedrolls side by side for the first time, though they did nothing more than hold each other as they fell asleep beneath the vast Wyoming sky. As they continued north into Montana territory, the weather grew colder. Snow dusted the higher elevations, and their progress slowed as they navigated increasingly difficult terrain. But the growing bond between them warmed their hearts, making the hardships easier to bear. In a small trading post near the Idaho border, they encountered a grizzled old prospector who had recently come from Wallace. "Silver's still flowing," he told them over cups of whiskey in the post's small tavern. "But it ain't easy money. Town's growing fast, got nearly 1,000 people now. Lots of opportunity, but lots of competition too." "What about work for a woman?" Abigail asked. "Teaching, perhaps, or bookkeeping?" The old man scratched his beard thoughtfully. There's a school, sure, though I don't know if they're hiring, but there's always need for educated folk. The mining companies need clerks, and there's a newspaper started up last year. Preston nodded. And housing. Is it hard to come by? Expensive, the prospector warned. Most new folks start out in tent cities or boarding houses till they can save up for something better. They thanked him for the information and returned to their wagon to discuss their options. We could stop here for the winter, Preston suggested. Find work, save up, head to Wallace in the spring when the passes are clearer. But Abigail shook her head. We've come this far. I don't want to stop when we're so close. Besides, she added with a smile, I'm curious to see this silver town that's been our destination all these months. Preston couldn't argue with her determination. Truth be told, he was eager to reach Wallace himself, to see if it could truly be the fresh start they both needed. The final leg of their journey was the most challenging. The roads grew steeper, winding through mountain passes where snow had already begun to accumulate. They joined a small caravan of supply wagons headed for the mining districts, finding safety in numbers as they navigated the treacherous mountain routes. It was late November when they finally crested the last ridge and saw Wallace spread out in the valley below them. Despite the prospector's description, Preston was unprepared for the bustling activity of the town. Buildings of wood and stone lined the main street, with construction ongoing at the edges. The silver smelters sent plumes of smoke into the crisp mountain air, and everywhere there were signs of prosperity and growth. We made it, Abigail breathed, her hand finding Preston's on the seat between them. It's really real. Preston squeezed her hand. Told you we'd get here. They guided their wagon down the winding road into town, joining the flow of traffic on the main street. Mining wagons loaded with ore rumbled past, while well-dressed businessmen and rough-clad miners shared the wooden sidewalks. Their first priority was finding a place to stay. Most of the boarding houses were full, but they eventually secured a room at a small establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Holloway, who looked Abigail up and down with a critical eye. I don't rent to unmarried couples, she said firmly. Preston opened his mouth to explain their situation, but Abigail spoke first. We understand completely, she said. My brother and I would never presume otherwise. We'll need 2 rooms if you have them available. Mrs. Holloway's expression softened slightly. Only got the 1 room left with 2 beds, but I suppose that would be proper enough for siblings. That would be perfect, Abigail said with a grateful smile. We've been traveling so long, any real bed would be a luxury. Once they were settled in their room, a small but clean space with 2 narrow beds separated by a worn privacy screen, Preston raised an eyebrow at Abigail. Brother and sister again, she shrugged, a mischievous glint in her eye. It seemed simpler than explaining. Besides, we'll need to establish ourselves here before people start gossiping about our arrangement. Preston nodded, though he felt a twinge of disappointment. Their relationship had grown so much during their journey, but now they were back in civilization, with its rules and judgments. We should probably look for work right away, he said, changing the subject. Our funds won't last long at boarding house rates. The next day, they split up to explore the town and seek employment. Preston headed toward the mining offices, while Abigail visited the school and the newspaper office. They met back at the boarding house for the evening meal, both with promising news. Preston had been hired as a security guard at one of the larger mines. His experience as a scout and his steady demeanor working in his favor. Abigail had not secured a teaching position. The school was fully staffed, but the newspaper editor had been impressed by her literacy and had offered her work as a typesetter. It's not exactly what I hoped for, she admitted as they sat in the boarding house parlor after dinner. "But it's a start. And Mr. Daniels said there might be opportunities to contribute articles once I learn the business." "That's wonderful, Abby," Preston said, wishing he could take her hand or kiss her cheek, but aware of Mrs. Holloway's watchful eye from across the room. "You'll be running the paper inside a year, I'd wager," she laughed. "And what about you? Are you content with guard duty?" Preston shrugged. "For now. The pay is good and it's honest work. Eventually, I might try my hand at prospecting or open a business of my own. This town is growing fast enough that there are opportunities everywhere." As the weeks passed, they settled into their new lives in Wallace. The work was demanding but rewarding, and they began to make friends among the townsfolk. Preston's fellow guards included veterans like himself, men who understood the shadows that sometimes clouded his eyes. Abigail found kindred spirits among the newspaper staff, particularly the editor's wife, Clara Daniels, who had been educated back east and shared Abigail's love of literature. But maintaining the pretense of being siblings grew increasingly difficult. Their feelings for each other had only deepened since arriving in Wallace, and the constraints of propriety chafed against their desire to build a life together. One crisp December evening, as they walked back to the boarding house after attending a community Christmas concert, Preston made a decision. "Abby," he said, stopping beneath a street lamp that cast a golden glow over the snow-dusted street, "I can't keep pretending you're my sister." Abigail looked up at him, her breath visible in the cold air. "What are you saying, Preston?" "I'm saying I love you," he stated simply. "I've loved you since somewhere on the trail between Texas and here, and I want to build a real life with you openly, honestly." Her eyes widened, and for a moment he feared he'd spoken too boldly. Then her face broke into a radiant smile. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much that sometimes it scares me." Preston took her gloved hands in his. "Then marry me, Abby. Let's start our new life here properly as husband and wife." Tears glistened in her eyes, catching the lamplight. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you, Preston Xavier." He lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, spinning her around as she laughed, her hands clinging to his shoulders. When he set her down, he kissed her, not caring who might see. "We'll have to tell Mrs. Holloway the truth," Abigail said when they finally broke apart, her eyes dancing with mischief. "She'll probably evict us on the spot," Preston groaned. "Probably," Abigail agreed cheerfully, "but it's worth it." To their surprise, Mrs. Holloway took the news better than expected. After a stern lecture about honesty and propriety, she offered them separate rooms until the wedding, provided they agreed to a short engagement. "This town needs more stable families," she said firmly. "Not more scandal, so you'll do things properly from now on." They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church on Pine Street, with half the town in attendance. Clara Daniels had helped Abigail sew a simple but elegant wedding dress, and Preston had splurged on a new suit for the occasion. Their fellow workers served as witnesses, and the newspaper ran a front-page announcement, celebrating two newcomers who had found love and a future in Wallace. With their combined savings, they were able to put a down payment on a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy, but solid and with room to grow. Preston continued his work at the mine, while Abigail's position at the newspaper evolved as Mr. Daniels recognized her talent for writing. By spring, she was contributing a weekly column on community affairs and helping to edit submissions from local correspondents. Their first year in Wallace brought both challenges and joys. The mining industry had its boom and bust cycles, and there were weeks when Preston's hours were cut back. But Abigail's work remained steady, and they managed their finances carefully, saving what they could for the future. It was during that first summer in their little house that Abigail discovered she was expecting a child. The news filled Preston with a mixture of joy and terror: joy at the thought of being a father, terror at the responsibility it entailed. What if I'm not good at it? He confessed to Abigail one evening as they sat on their small porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. Being a father, I mean. Abigail took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. You will be wonderful, she said confidently. Look at everything you've done for me, rescuing a stranger, protecting her across 2,000 miles of wilderness, helping her build a new life. If you can do all that, you can certainly love our child. Preston smiled, drawing her close against his side. Our child, he repeated, the words both strange and wonderful on his lips. I never thought I'd have a family of my own. Well, you do now, Abigail said, resting her head on his shoulder, and it's only going to get bigger and better. As autumn painted the surrounding forests in brilliant colors, their circle of friends and acquaintances in Wallace continued to grow. Preston had been promoted to head of security at the mine, a position that came with better pay and more regular hours. Abigail had reduced her time at the newspaper as her pregnancy progressed, but she continued to write her column from home, her insights into community life making her something of a local celebrity. Their house had become a gathering place for fellow transplants to Wallace, people who, like them, had come seeking new beginnings. Sunday dinners around their expanding table were filled with laughter and stories, the sharing of hopes and plans for the future. On a snowy February night in 1878, their son was born after a long and difficult labor. They named him Samuel Thomas Xavier, after both their fathers. As Preston held his son for the first time, marveling at the tiny fingers and the shock of dark hair so like his own, he felt a sense of completion he had never known was possible. He's perfect, he whispered, carefully returning the swaddled infant to Abigail's arms. Of course he is, she said, exhausted but radiant. Look who his parents are. Preston laughed softly, leaning down to kiss her forehead. I never properly thanked you, you know. For what? For collapsing in that cotton field, he said, only half joking. If you hadn't, I might have ridden right past the Marshall plantation. Might never have met you. Abigail smiled, stroking their son's cheek with a gentle finger. Then I suppose it was all worth it, wasn't it? Every hardship, every mile, every uncertainty. It all led us here to this moment. Preston couldn't argue with that logic. Every step of their journey, from the Texas cotton fields to this snowy night in Idaho, had been necessary to create the life they now shared. As young Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the town of Wallace continued to prosper. The silver mines were producing record yields, and new businesses were opening monthly. Preston, with his saved earnings and a small loan from the bank, opened a supply store catering to the miners and prospectors who continued to flood into the area. Abigail, once Samuel was old enough for a nursemaid to watch him part-time, returned to the newspaper, eventually becoming its editor when Mr. Daniels retired. Their little family expanded again in 1880 with the birth of their daughter, Elizabeth Rose. Unlike her brother's dramatic entry into the world, Elizabeth arrived quickly and with minimal fuss, as if eager to join the family that awaited her. She has your determination, Preston told Abigail as they watched their daughter nurse vigorously. Heaven help us when she starts walking. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family, community involvement, and quiet evenings at home. They added rooms to their house as their needs and means grew, including a small study where Abigail could write undisturbed and a workshop where Preston crafted furniture in his spare time, a skill he had learned from his father. In the summer of 1881, they received an unexpected letter forwarded from Clearwater, Texas. It was from Dr. Thompson, who had treated Abigail 5 years earlier. "Thought you might want to know," the doctor wrote. "Hiram Marshall died last month. His plantation has been divided and sold off. Some of his former workers have bought parcels of the land. Seems fitting somehow." Abigail read the letter twice, then passed it to Preston without comment. That night, after the children were asleep, he found her sitting on the porch swing, gazing at the stars. "Are you all right?" he asked, joining her. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I thought I might feel something, satisfaction perhaps, or even lingering anger, but I feel nothing. It's as if that part of my life happened to someone else entirely." Preston understood. The memories of Texas seemed distant now, like scenes from a book he had read long ago rather than events he had lived through. "We've come a long way," he said, putting his arm around her shoulders. Abigail leaned into him, her head finding its familiar place against his chest. "And we've built something beautiful." In the years that followed, Wallace continued to grow, though not without setbacks. Fires swept through portions of the town in 1883 and again in 1884, testing the community's resilience. The Xavier family was fortunate their home and Preston's store were spared, but they joined in the efforts to rebuild, offering shelter to those who had lost everything and contributing to the reconstruction fund. Samuel, now 7, was showing signs of his father's mechanical aptitude, while 4-year-old Elizabeth had inherited her mother's love of words, demanding story after story at bedtime. A third child joined the family in 1885, another boy they named James, a peaceful baby with his mother's golden hair and thoughtful expression. In the autumn of 1886, on the 10th anniversary of their arrival in Wallace, Preston and Abigail took their children on a picnic to the ridge where they had first seen the town spread out below them. While the children played nearby, supervised by Samuel, who took his role as eldest very seriously, the couple sat side by side, looking down at the community that had become their home. "Could you have imagined this?" Abigail asked, gesturing to the thriving town below, then to their children, and finally to the space between herself and Preston. "Any of it," Preston shook his head. "Not in my wildest dreams. I was just trying to outrun my war memories when I stopped at that plantation." "And I was just trying to survive another day," Abigail added. "It's strange to think how close we came to never meeting, if you had passed by an hour earlier or later." "I believe we were meant to find each other," Preston said, taking her hand. "Call it fate or God's plan or just dumb luck, but I'm grateful for it every day." Abigail squeezed his hand. "So am I." They watched as Elizabeth tackled her older brother, both children dissolving into laughter as they rolled in the grass. Baby James sat nearby, solemnly examining a pine cone with the focused attention only a 1-year-old can muster. "I want to do something," Abigail said suddenly. "To mark this anniversary, something meaningful." Preston raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" "I've been saving from my newspaper salary," she explained. "Almost $1,500 now. I was thinking we could establish a fund for education, perhaps, or to help people starting new lives here the way we did." Preston's chest tightened with pride and love. Even after all they had built together, Abigail's generosity continued to amaze him. "That's a wonderful idea," he said. "We could call it the New Beginnings Fund." "Perfect," Abigail agreed. "Because that's what Wallace gave us, a new beginning. It seems right to help others find theirs." The fund was established that winter, with an announcement in the newspaper and a small ceremony at the town hall. Initially focused on educational scholarships for children who couldn't afford school fees, It eventually expanded to include emergency assistance for families in crisis and small business loans for promising ventures that traditional banks deemed too risky. As their children grew, Preston and Abigail made sure they understood their family's history, not just the triumphs, but the struggles as well. They told them about the Texas cotton fields and the long journey north, about the courage it took to start anew in an unfamiliar place, and about the kindness of strangers that had made their success possible. "Your mother is the strongest person I've ever known," Preston told his children one evening as they sat around the fireplace. "Remember that when life gets difficult, you come from strength." "And your father," Abigail added, her eyes meeting Preston's across the room, "is the most honorable man I've ever met. He taught me that one person's choices can change another's life completely." By the turn of the century, Wallace had transformed from a rough mining town into a proper city, with paved streets, electric lighting, and a new brick schoolhouse where Samuel taught mathematics. Elizabeth, following in her mother's footsteps, had become a writer for the very newspaper where Abigail had started as a typesetter. Young James, now 15, was apprenticed to a local physician, his gentle nature well suited to healing. Preston and Abigail, their hair now streaked with silver, remained active in community affairs, though they had passed the daily operation of their businesses to capable managers. Their home, expanded over the years, was still a gathering place for family and friends, the Sunday dinner tradition continuing with the addition of Samuel's wife and their young twins. "Did you ever imagine we'd be grandparents?" Abigail asked one evening as they sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset as they had done countless times before. "Honestly, no," Preston admitted with a chuckle. "That first day when I found you in the fields, I wasn't thinking beyond getting you to a doctor. And then during our journey, I was just focused on reaching Wallace safely." "When did you know?" she asked, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "That this us was going to be forever," Preston thought for a moment. "There wasn't one single moment," he said finally. "It was 1,000 little moments. The way you insisted on doing your share of the work even when you were still recovering. The stories you told about your parents. The first time I heard you laugh, really laugh, not just being polite. By the time we reached Colorado, I couldn't imagine my life without you in it." Abigail smiled, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening. "For me, it was the thunder. The thunder, that night in the foothills when there was that terrible storm. You built that lean-to for us, and when I was frightened by the thunder, you held my hand all night. You didn't make me feel foolish for being afraid. You just stayed. That's when I knew." Preston leaned over and kissed her, a gentle touch of lips that held decades of shared history. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured against her mouth. "What was?" Abigail asked. "Kissing me, stopping at the Marshall plantation," Preston clarified, though his eyes twinkled with humor. "Though kissing you is a close second." As night fell over Wallace, bringing with it a canopy of stars, Preston and Abigail Xavier remained on their porch, hands entwined, surrounded by the life they had built together. From the cotton fields of Texas to the silver mountains of Idaho, their journey had been one of courage, determination, and ultimately, profound love, a love that had not only survived hardship but had been strengthened by it, like silver refined in fire. And in the quiet of the evening, as the town below them settled into sleep, they knew with absolute certainty that every step of that journey had been worth taking.